Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the interviews of the European Livestock Voice. Today, we have a guest that many of you already know, probably, and is Tasos Haniotis. He worked for a long time as a director of strategy and policy analysis at the European Commission, DG of Agriculture and Rural Development, and not only. So I know that you do much more also nowadays. So welcome, Tasos. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Thanks to everybody. Yes, I'm doing pretty much stuff, and since last week, I have joined non-residents from quite some distance, but I've joined the International Institute of Applied System Analysis, which is outside Vienna, and I would like to focus there on working on measurable ways of dealing with sustainable productivity. I will be focusing on wheat.
Right. Congratulations. I think I'm pretty sure you can take your huge experience and expertise. So, well, congratulations and thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to ask you many things, so I hope I don't take too much of your time. But I've seen you speaking live because you're pretty busy also as a panelist, and I heard you speaking, for instance, about the EU Green Deal, because here at the European Livestock Voice, we dealt a lot also with the farm to fork strategy. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, for sure, what are the differences between the world today and the world when the EU Green Deal, so the farm to fork strategy, were first launched, conceived? I mean, is it the same world we are living in?
There is one thing that is clearly the same, and this is that climate change continues to be the major challenge we're facing. And as time progresses, we see more and more that it's evident everywhere. But there are some things that have changed significantly. First of all, we had the COVID crisis. And the COVID crisis impacted many parts of society, but there is one area that impacted less, and that was the big surprise, which is the food system. Despite all the claims to the opposite, the food system improved that it was extremely resilient, more than any other sector in the economy. And that is something not to idealize the situation, but to show that there are some lessons that we must get out of it. The second thing that significantly changed is all the energy, the increase in the energy costs that started before the war of Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And the third thing that happened, of course, is the Russian invasion in Ukraine that brought into the forefront not only the energy link and dependence that we had in the European Union, but also a major impact in terms of the role of Ukraine in world markets, especially in wheat, and raise and brought into the forefront issues of food security. So for me, and I've written and spoken about this extensively, the real challenge we face is how we bring together concerns on climate change and food security in a manner that will not stop what we have to do, but will find ways that we can manage to bring those two together, not as competing against each other, but as complementing an overall strategy like the Green Deal.
And how, I mean, my question was pretty rhetorical, of course, because these last years we've seen a lot going on. And but I take the opportunity to ask you already this, because it's something I wanted to ask you later on. How can we get rid of this polarization? So how can we go beyond the choice between tackling climate change and food security? Because we are living in times of huge polarization also when it comes to this topic. So how can we go beyond that?
Well, let me start with something that is just coming to me, because yesterday I had to speak with a former colleague, not from DG Agri, but from another part of the commission, and I was explaining what I want to do. And what I heard is, what you do is nice, but why do you talk about productivity? Can't you find something else? And that's my starting point, because this is a colleague that I respect a lot and agreed with what I like to do, actually marrying the concept of productivity and sustainability. And I think we need to start from that. There is a big misunderstanding, which is explainable, about productivity and productivism. We know that in the last 50, 60 years, I mean, after the Second World War, economic growth had very significant economic and social benefits at the expense of the environment. And this is where this fear about productivism, which is confused with productivity, comes. Is this discussion about to do the same? Now, my answer to that is no. There are ways out there and many practices that cover the full spectrum of agricultural practices, from organic and regenerative agriculture all the way to precision farming, from intensive to extensive, that demonstrate that you can actually increase productivity and reduce your footprint. This is measurable, but it's not generalized. So if we really manage to focus on that, then I believe that we can stop having this polarized debate. But this requires, in my view, to address also issues that relate to the role of science in our societies and the concerns that exist about that. A typical example is all the resistance we have in vaccination. And I'm not talking about the vaccination of COVID, I'm talking about basic things, a triple vaccine for children. I mean, if you do have issues and resistance on issues relating to human health, you can imagine what happens when we move about science on animal or plant health, that is more tricky. So that's where we need to work significantly on that. And there is a serious communication problem that we have, actually.
So basically, what's now coming back to my starting provocative question, speaking of health, wealth, productivity, food scarcity, food security, do you think is the farm to fork strategy well drafted at the moment?
The farm to fork strategy is drafted as it is drafted. And by the way, if one takes out of the debate what, in my view, has also polarized things, what is this quantitative targets, which are not binding, by the way, and focuses on the specific priorities and the objectives, that's exactly what was proposed with the CAP before. So the issue is not the drafting. The issue is what is being implemented on the ground and how much of this is measurable. And I think that's where the debate should go. And my feeling is that I have been among those that was pushing for these specific words, soil, water, air, and biodiversity in the farm to fork strategy and before in the CAP, because they demonstrate where we need to put the focus to the various measures that we have. My feeling is that in the public debate, we have put sort of the cart in front of the horses. All four are extremely important, but the real leverage we have is with soil. Soil, if you want, is the less sexy item, but if you do good things in the soil, you do good things for water, you do good things for air and emissions, and you do very good things for biodiversity. If you focus on the other areas, you can isolate what you do and do miracles in certain areas, but you don't have a control over the whole of agricultural area. And that is where a lot of what member states are doing and what individuals are doing has to be better explained and better identified, because it is only by demonstrating that there are already, at a very regional, localized level sometimes, extremely good practices that demonstrate that you can improve your performance in the soil and therefore increase productivity without negatively impacting, on the contrary, by positively impacting the environment, then the debate can be more concrete. Because I'm afraid right now, part of the reason that the debate is polarized, it is because general, rather philosophical and to the point.
Yeah, maybe ideological even sometimes have this feeling.
Well, I don't want to use the term ideological, first of all, because I also was young at a certain point of time, and I think ideological priorities is what is natural to exist in all societies. But I think in all ideologies have to go through the filter of the reality check. and you have to check whether what you're doing applies to your ideas, make the necessary modifications, and sometimes even change your initial ideas if you see that they don't work.
Yeah, we can speak long about that, because personally I lived that. I was having a pretty ideological approach when I was younger, and then you get more realistic, and you start learning things, and if you are willing to do that, you can change your mind. So the fact is that many people seem not to do that, even when they're no more young, and they have maybe some important positions, but that's my personal polemics. And now, connected to this, to all these topics, you spoke about COVID and the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Are we risking, and if yes, what are the risks we are facing in the EU regarding food security? Because I have the feeling sometimes that in our wealthy bubble, we are taking a bit too much for granted, that it cannot happen here, that we live problems like food scarcity. So are we risking something? If yes, what?
Well, I think we need to clarify that food security is not and cannot be a European, an American, or a specific issue of one part of the world. It's a global problem like climate change. For the same reason that it doesn't really matter if we do excellent things on emissions and the rest of the world is doing exactly the opposite, it doesn't really matter if we feel that we are safe with respect to food, if another part of the world is facing problems. Now, in terms of food security, and in terms of, if you want, the food gaps, we need to clarify and distinguish two things. When it comes to the livestock sector, which is the sector that you represent, most of the growth that is taking place is happening in Asia, and it's happening in countries that have the capacity, through their overall economy and their exports of other products, to import the additional food they need. And most of this food is actually either in meats or in feed that is used for the animal sector. When it comes to the typical food security product like wheat, which is a definition of food security, the real problem is in Africa. And the problem there is that Africa is growing with 2.3% annual rate of population, and will add one United States of America in the next 10 years. And this is where, if you want, the role of Europe and also the potential role of Ukraine in the future becomes extremely important. Because the gap of wheat deficit, and also to a certain degree of rice deficit in Africa, is growing. And it's growing even before we take into account the impact of what is happening in Sahel in terms of security without food security. So there is a real issue with respect to numbers, the availability aspect of food security, and it has a name, and it's called Africa. And part of it in North Africa, also in the Middle East, has to do with climate change. Then we have a second issue that is new in the European Union, and that is the affordability aspect of food security. And what we have seen is that in this century, we have had 3 commodity booms and busts, including in agricultural prices. But it's the first time that food inflation is growing, is rising much higher than the overall level of inflation. And that has created a very significant problem in a part of the population that we tend to forget that exists in the European Union, and has reversed the trend to have a lower expenditure on food. And the same thing applies for energy. And that's a real dilemma with respect to the Green Deal. Because if the issue is how do we make food more expensive to integrate and internalize externalities, as for years environmental economists used to say, the paradox is that we made, or food became more expensive, and the environment got nothing out of it. And that's why I insist that for the environment to get something out of it, we need to go back to the basics, which is that we have to increase productivity. We have to reduce our marginal cost of production, but we have to do it in a manner that improves the environmental footprint. And there are examples out there that demonstrate that this is possible. And if you want, this is so frustrating for me in all the years that I've dealt with that, because instead of communicating the positive elements, we go about with a catastrophology that scares people, but doesn't convince the ones that have to be convinced that we can do things in a different way.
I understand. I mean, I see what you mean. And I have to think, you made me think also of something you said during one of your speeches recently. So either food goes where people need it, or people go where food is available. Also showing that everything is connected. Also when you speak about, when we hear speaking about migrations and climate change.
Yeah, and by the way, to clarify things, because orally sometimes you say things in a very condensed way. When I mean food goes where people need it, it's not only the quantities of food, and I believe that Africa will need more than what it's capable to produce, but also the knowledge about how we produce food, which we have in Europe, which is not pertinent in every part of Africa because it has different climates, but there are certain elements of what we're doing that are very pertinent. And also there are lessons that we can learn from other countries about how they're doing certain things in a way that is much more mild to the environment than ours. But this is where the debate has to be on numbers. For example, we have had for quite some time now this debate about the role of livestock, and especially cattle and methane. Well, in Europe, in the European Union, the number of cattle is going down. Methane is a huge problem if the numbers go up. It's a different type of problem if you are in a steady state, and it's a completely different, it's not a problem anymore if your cattle numbers are going down. But if you put in the developed world the number of animals of cattle we have in the EU, in the US, in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand, they're less than what Brazil alone has. Africa is 70% more on this cattle, but this cattle is grazing on very extensive land, and it's a completely different basis. So if we just take one animal and multiply by a certain coefficient and come up with an emission factor, we really miss the debate about where we need to focus our discussion, what type of policy adjustments we need to do something that I think we all agree. We have to be much more sustainable in the future if we want to address climate challenge. But maybe we have put too much emphasis on some mitigation model results about 2040 or 2050, and we forgot that if we look at adaptation measures that already happen right now, that could help us understand how we are going to reach better the targets we have set for 20 or 30 years down the road.
So does it really, I mean, considering the fact that cattle is decreasing in, let's speak of Europe and in all the Western world, and quite some achievement. I mean, we already did a lot in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Does it make sense to go on pushing so much European farmers as the EU regulations are doing?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, what regulations and in which way they're pushing, there are other people working right now in the European Commission that have to explain all the details. But in terms of understanding that the sector has to do certain things, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing, I'm very clearly positive that the sector has to look at what it's actually doing. And there are areas in the sector that are very performant. And there are other areas where probably we have too many animals, and we see it in all the additional environmental problems that it creates. And I think what the sector needs to do is better communicate in an open way, both the positive elements it has, and the most positive element, it produces food that is of extremely high importance for human diets. And then at the same time, understand that part of this production is happening with too much pressure on the environment, and their adjustments are being made. And I think one of the things that we have missed in this discussion is the issue of the role of foods. And I come to that listening to the meeting I was on productivity last week on OECD from one of the big experts in the world on productivity that mentioned that when we talk about land, we have the tendency to use land as an input, while land is actually an output. It's not only land, food is an output. Food is life. Too much food goes against a healthy diet. So where you bring the balance is the real challenge that we face today. And in the debate we're having, and I sound old-fashioned here, I think we use much less numbers than what we used in the past. And we use more and more, nice graphs that appear attractive to the eye, but do not necessarily translate in measurable, concrete solutions on the ground.
And in saying all this, and again, considering your experience and the fact that, as far as I understood and I've seen, you are a quite free thinker, let's say, in the Brussels bubble since ever. How you think the EU policies right now are impacting on all these subjects, from food security, to agricultural productivity, emissions?
Yeah, I think policies are impacting, but are being impacted by a public debate that we have had in the European Union that is very polarized. And that is where I see the risks that we have as a European Union. I mean, forget it for a moment about biodiversity and talk about diversity in general. What is the big advantage of the European Union? It is exactly its capacity to have so diverse cultures, backgrounds, and even languages. How we turn this potential advantage we have into a real competitive advantage is the big challenge we face. But very often we have the tendency to use this this diversity to fight against each other's logic. And this is the paradox. The paradox is that we communicate in a language that is formal to parties that mostly are outside the European Union. Only the Irish have English as one of the official languages. All the rest of us have to find ways of bringing all the cultural diversity we bring through a means of translating what we have to do. And, from our national backgrounds, we know that we have to use our hands much more than others from other parts of Europe have to say the same thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a negative point. It means that we find a way of bringing together our starting points and finding something common. But you need to go through the tensions and be clear about what the reasons of the tensions are before you actually come up with a synthesis, with synergies. And what I'm afraid that I'm seeing more and more is a mentality of group thinking instead of an open dialogue about the different starting points. We should not fear that, but we need to have a common ground where when we say that a number is a number and a fact is a fact, we don't have parallel universes that another fact is what matters. I mean, if you look in the modern world and you listen to some of the documentaries that exist about why the Earth is flat, it appears theoretically logical. Okay, now, is the Earth flat? Can you apply a policy with a notion that the Earth is flat? No, but that is, a fact-based discussion that no matter how eloquent arguments could be, it doesn't pass the reality check. And we have to do more and more of that in some of the policy decisions we're taking. And I don't think this is going to be bad. The other thing that I believe strongly is that we need to prioritize. If you open all fronts at the same time, then you risk losing too many things. That's why I mentioned before soil. It's not that the other things are not important, but I think through soil we can have better successes in water, air, and biodiversity than going the other way around.
And livestock can sure help with that.
That's a typical example of what differs Europe from others. extensive notion of livestock, especially permanent grassland, but also the value-added element of our livestock products. I used to give an example, and it's, I think it was 2007 in a seminar in the US, in a debate about dairy policy, where I told them, for you, butter is a bulk commodity that comes in a 20-kilogram box. For us, it's a 250-gram package that comes with a brand name, with a different taste and a different smell. And that's the huge difference. Our agriculture is not commodity bulk-based. It's value-added product. And this is something that we need to use, not to, I mean, we have the tendency of self-flagellation, sometimes of self-congratulation. The world is not black and white, but in our food system, we have things to show that overwhelmingly are not only better than what others are doing, but on the positive side. And if we actually demonstrate this, then we should be able, with more certainty and confidence, also address our weak points, which are also very significant.
Well, I hope we can keep that in mind. And well, with you, I would go on speaking much longer, because on top there is these nuances of philosophical, sociological subjects, which I'm very passionate of, but I will stop it here. And in case I will bother you again in future, if you like. And for the time being, I really thank you for your time, and I invite everyone to follow you on the social media, and to be present, if possible, when you are a speaker, a panelist, because it's very interesting to see you speaking and to see you sharing your experience, your expertise. So thank you again very much, and see you soon again.
Thanks for the opportunity. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Where is it? Here. Okay.
Good.